Welcome everybody to our first meeting this year of the Harvard Seminar on History and Policy. Welcome to the Kennedy School. If you're not from the Kennedy School, thank you all for coming. My name is Moshe Temkin. I teach history here, and together with Alex Kesar, who's sitting over there, I am the convener of this seminar. We're very pleased to kick off the year with two distinguished speakers, Samuel Moyn and Sewall. As many of you know, external events forced us to reschedule this meeting from last week, and Professors Moyn and Sewall were both kind and flexible enough to accommodate this new date, so thanks to both of you. Before we begin, a quick note about our upcoming meetings. On Thursday, October 18, it's 2 weeks from now, we will be hosting Professor David Engerman of Brandeis University, who will be speaking about development as a Cold War weapon, foreign experts, and the rise of Indian economists. And then on Thursday, November 15, we will be hosting a panel discussion on the topic of what can history teach us about global trafficking. So I'll introduce our invited speaker first, and then after he's done, I'll introduce our commentator. Our invited speaker today, Samuel Moyn, has a restless mind and a searching approach to scholarship, teaching, and intellectual life generally. Although on the outside he may appear calm and composed, his soul is actually the subject of a fierce ongoing battle between history and law. This struggle has been going on for quite some time, and I doubt that it will be resolved this evening. In any case, Samuel Moyn is a visiting professor this year at the law school here, where he teaches courses on the history and theory of human rights and on legal thought now. He taught similarly last year at the Yale Law School. Normally, he is a professor of history at Columbia, where he has been since 2001, I believe. And he's also the editor of the excellent interdisciplinary journal, Humanities. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to go through the list of all the books and essays he has published, or the awards and fellowships that he has won, or his other contributions to the profession. But I will mention that his most recent book, which was published in 2010, is The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, which he wrote as a Guggenheim Fellow. The title of his talk today is From My Lai to Abu Ghraib, How Americans Learn to Oppose Atrocity Rather Than Aggression.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks, Moshe, for hauling me in here on my sabbatical, no less. And thanks to Sarah in advance for criticizing what I have to say. I'm just going to kick around a very simple question for 45 minutes. I'm unsure about the answer, and you tell me what you think. The question is, how do we gain historical purchase on the debates around the law of war that we've had in this country, specifically, since 9/11? I'm actually going to run through 3 stories that have emerged before giving you a fourth. That way you'll have a menu in case you don't like the dish I serve. So 2 partisan narratives cropped up right away, at least into the Iraq War, once consensus around the war broke down. So one was let's call it a liberal narrative. I'm going to take as our liberal narrator, Jane Mayer, New Yorker journalist. I think she was extraordinarily influential in telling us what to think about the relation between how the law of war was treated after 9/11 and earlier American history. She claimed as follows: our nation's commitment to the law of war was ancient and strong, and she did so in order to cast George W. Bush and his servants as abhorrent outliers to pristine national traditions. There wasn't anything new about torture, Jane Mayer wrote when she collected her famous articles as the book, The Dark Side. Torture's authorization by the Bush administration, however, represented a dramatic break from the past. America had done more than any nation to abolish torture and other violations of human rights, as she put it. But now the U.S. became the first nation ever to authorize violations of the Geneva Conventions. And then she added this extraordinary assertion: This country has in the past faced other mortal enemies equally, if not more threatening, without endangering its moral authority. Now, in her book, she proceeded, I think, very provocatively by celebrating some conservatives, Jack Goldsmith, whom I'll say a lot more about, and Alberto Mora, you may remember his name. They refused to compromise their integrity and morality when all the president's men asked them to do so. When Alan Brinkley, my colleague, Moshik's doctoral advisor, reviewed The Dark Side on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, he agreed with this narrative. He said, it would be difficult to find any precedent in American history for the scale, brutality, and illegality of Bush-era conduct. Well, I'm afraid that's not very difficult to find such conduct, notably during the Cold War. And I just dismiss this first narrative I'm offering you, this liberal narrative, unceremoniously. You can try to revive it if you want. It seems to have been generated for a pretty narrowly partisan attack on the president at the time. And I think it actually worked. So it may have been useful history, albeit bad history. But most obviously it leaves out that the worst criminality in American war that I know about, and indeed counterinsurgent war, was sponsored by Democrats during the Vietnam era. But let me come back to the Vietnam era. Now, as a second course, consider a kind of alternative, opposite conservative narrative. And for the conservative narrative, I'll cite Jack Goldsmith, our colleague here now. He had been a protagonist in Jane Mayer's narrative, and because he was the Office of Legal Counsel head who tore up John Hughes' torture methods. Now, unlike Jane Mayer, Goldsmith claims that there's a seismic shift that somehow created brand new legal conditions after 9/11 for the prosecution of American war. Mayer saw the law of war as strong in national traditions until George Bush came, where Goldsmith says it came out of nowhere as soon as George Bush came. Both can't be right. Goldsmith in his book says that war had become newly legalized. It's now, he writes, encumbered with legal restrictions as never before. In his words, many people thought the Bush administration was indifferent to wartime legal constraints. But the opposite is true. The administration has been strangled by law. That was Goldsmith's view. Now, I actually think this narrative comes much closer to the truth. But it doesn't tell us why this shift happened. And the apparent implication of Goldsmith's book is that officious liberals ruined things at some point by bringing in an international law that just hadn't figured in American policymaking before. For Goldsmith, that law now strangles officials who should exercise good judgment. That's essentially the thesis of his book. Now, it would be tough to choose between these narratives, but now we have another party heard from, and I've just introduced this new party because you may have heard about this if you read the New York Times. The new party is John Witt, a Yale law professor, who's just published this remarkable book, was floridly reviewed positively in the New York Times last Sunday. And he focuses on the 19th century. He builds his account around a factoid that the rules of war in modern times were first codified or written down by an American or a German transplant to America named Francis Lieber during the Civil War. I'd say Witt's goal in this book, which everyone should read, I think you'll hear lots about it in the coming months. Witt wants to, let's say, be Goethe to America's Faust. His thesis is that there are two souls battling in the American breast. one, since the beginning, the founders, wants to bring enlightenment to the world, which means humanizing war through law. The other wants to deploy massive deadly force to strategic ends. And so if you like, Francis Lieber and William Tecumseh Sherman are America's Jekyll and Hyde, the two souls still at war with each other even after 9/11. Now you could say Witt is giving us a neat trick with respect to the first two narratives. He's subsuming them. It turns out both are true, or there are people who represent both sides in American history. And it's precisely this combination of Enlightenment allegiance to legalizing war and the deployment of massive deadly force in a unique combination for Americans that distinguishes our history, including after 9/11, and accounting for our debates. So I think this argument is also problematic. Let me just mention 3 quick problems with John's book. Although I've written a blurb for it, everyone should read it. It's fantastic. So one problem offhand is that it seems like it's a book about American exceptionalism. Lots of nations contributed to the law of war, and it was a German here who made the breakthrough during the Civil War. In fact, if we look, the most enthusiastic nation about the international law of war in the 19th century was not America, but the Russian Empire. And more generally, I think every nation wants to see itself as a moral paragon. That's what nationalism is about. And conversely, every nation uses the tools in its power, including in war. So the idea that there's something specifically American about the massive use of force, where there's a story as if Switzerland accumulates volumes about constraints on war and America deploys force, probably has less to do with cultural genetics than about the fact that one country's weak and the other is powerful, and America uses its power not because it's America, but because it's powerful. Now, a second issue you might wonder about in John's book about the 19th century is coin, counterinsurgency. So America's big engagements since World War II have been counterinsurgent long wars, at least when actual violence was deployed. And yet, as far as I know, there wasn't until recently any attempt to legalize, let alone humanize, counterinsurgent and asymmetrical war. Francis Lieber himself was very permissive about coin. It was in a different category from regular warfare. And this matters because until very recently, a different set of assumptions applied to extra-European spaces where counterinsurgent war has been typically, though not always, fought. So if brutality in coin, counterinsurgent warfare, seems wrong to us or a necessary relation to some humanizing or legalizing project, can't have anything to do with the U.S. Civil War. Something else happened. In terms of who's in the room, we could point to Sarah and say, where did Sarah come from? Someone who is actually involved in a project of humanizing coin. I don't think the answer is the U.S. Civil War, briefly. Something else had to happen. As late as the global wars of decolonization and after 1945, counterinsurgency was intentionally brutal with widespread popular support. We can't explain why those attitudes went away, then we can't explain our debates since 9/11. I don't think, since they're chiefly about how we fight counterinsurgency. Lastly, thirdly, the Faustian explanation fails to reckon with the fact that America wasn't a superpower in the 19th century and it became one. So if we think about the Cold War, it doesn't seem like we can find America's two souls on hand anymore. There's just one, the brutal one, for a long time. So consider the following facts. America rejected human rights treaties after World War II and still largely does, but it participated eagerly in the negotiation of the Geneva Conventions ratified them, applied them to our armies. And the other players in the Geneva Conventions were the colonial powers who weren't giving up their empires. So if you think that the Geneva Conventions, their negotiation and ratification were breakthrough events, then we have to figure out what we do with the conflicts in the following places in the several decades after. The Philippines, in which the United States was involved pretty brutally right away. Korea, in which we hadn't yet ratified the conventions, but we're in the process of doing so, and unleashed untold brutality. The Brits, we had Kenya and many other places. The French had Algeria, Vietnam, where we also went, and probably lots of other places. And indeed, what we've seen since 9/11 seems, if we're talking about just torture and brutality, like de minimis, like small beer compared to what transpired then. And that's because no one thought at the time, as far as I can tell, that the Geneva Conventions were either particularly humanitarian documents in general or applicable to colonial warfare in particular. And as I'll try to show, when America began to fight in Vietnam, though it wasn't its own colonial space, it still fought as if the Geneva Conventions were not relevant to the way it fought. There was next to no discussion of the Geneva Conventions during the Cold War in this country, during Korea, during Vietnam. And so I'm wondering, on the basis of these facts, where the good soul of the United States is. Maybe it's just tired and awakening after 1989 or 2001. So that's why I essentially agree with Jack Goldsmith that something changed and changed recently. But everything again depends on when, how, and why. And again, the puzzle is that Professor Goldsmith doesn't tell us. He just says it happened. And what I want to investigate is why. I'm going to claim that if we want to explain that, we have to start with the Vietnam crisis. When we return to the politics of that crisis in the United States, even just to look comparatively at how international law figured in it, we don't find what Jack Goldsmith appeared to want to find. A kind of nostalgic longing gratified for an executive facing no constraints with respect to how war was conducted. There was an anti-war movement after a few years. And we might even see, unlike after 9/11, a kind of invigorating memory of an executive who faces political contest with respect to war, not just how it's fought, but the fact that it was being waged at all. So note, as I'm turning to my fourth course, or my narrative, that none of the first narratives I've given you include this key distinction. The law of war has never, since the beginning of the law of war, been dominantly about how armies fight. It was always primarily about when it was right to fight in the first place. I'm referring to the distinction between jus ad bellum and jus in bello. And in fact, if you'd stopped the clock before Vietnam, I think you would have said that the most significant 20th century event in the law of war was reviving jus ad bellum, just war theory, which many people thought had been lost since the Middle Ages. Probably as early as the 19th century peace movements, but certainly at the time of the Kellogg-Briand Pact, the focus of international law was on getting rid of war, not humanizing war. And it was the concern to get rid of war that, among other things, allowed America to prosecute the Germans at Nuremberg after World War II, primarily as aggressors for their crimes against peace, and not for committing atrocities, which were largely left out of the Nuremberg trials. Now, given all that, here's my narrative. which I want to explore in my time. I think widespread concern about crimes of war, especially in counterinsurgent circumstances, came out of Vietnam after My Lai, after the My Lai revelations in late 1969. But this occurred even as the former hopes of criminalizing aggressive war through international law were left behind, maybe irretrievably, although the International Criminal Court wants to bring that charge back. Our American post-9/11 debates have thus been only about part of the law of war, the law of war already truncated, only about how we fight, rather than about when it's legal to do so. And in terms of dissent that we've seen in this country, it's meant that we've lived recently through an era of merely anti-torture politics. Certainly not the anti-war politics whose last big gasp occurred in the Vietnam era. Now let me try to spell out that argument. I think it's fair to say we haven't talked much about Vietnam since 9/11, except for a few people who have raised it to worry about quagmire, like Bernard Kalb, I think, that is associated with the Kennedy School, has done so in a few articles in the book. Now, I want to enter one caveat. I want to look at the way international law figured in the Vietnam crisis, just so we have a comparison for the way it's figured since 9/11. But I want to emphasize a kind of threshold point. I'm going to be saying that we lack the debate about legal aggression that was so prominent during Vietnam. But the much bigger fact, if we look back then, is that there were lots of alternative non-legal frameworks for engaging the morality of war. And most of those frameworks are also gone. So as I understand it, during Vietnam, opposition to the war, a moral outrage about its conduct, wasn't framed in terms of law. The Geneva Conventions weren't mentioned almost at all. Instead, ethical, religious, and political frameworks predominated. And those in turn were linked to other political projects. So the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement overlapped. Whereas the same is not true of our anti-torture politics, which is not connected to other big political agendas. So the first important fact, I think, when we look back at Vietnam era debate, when there were all these massive political movements, is that there was just much less attention to the law of war of any kind. I'm going to mention a Princeton professor at the time named Richard Falk, who was the main person trying to invoke international law against and around the Vietnam War. And at the end of it, he wrote as follows: "It's a humbling realization to acknowledge that only international lawyers have been paying attention to the international law arguments on the war." But I think it was because of the presence of alternative frameworks of engaging war, including ones connected with contestatory politics, that the legalization of the Vietnam took the form it did. It was never separate from explicit concern about the politics of the war itself. When we look from 1965 through the My Lai revelations and beyond, we find that all the attention was on the jus ad bellum justification of the Vietnam War, rather than the jus in bello validity of how it was fought. Even though there was much information available about our brutality, the horrendous violations of international standards to which we stooped. In light of the post-9/11 torture debate, it's just shocking, I think, that when we look back, we find that no one, including the war's critics, made much of the rules governing how we fight for a very long time. No John Yoo needed to emerge to exempt America from those rules. For some reason, it was just too early for these sorts of laws to pose a threat to how it was waged. And even when it's true there were late-breaking efforts after My Lai to target crimes, those efforts were generally allied to the anti-war movement, the movement to end the war. And in a sense were attempts to pursue that movement with new tools or by other means. Okay, let me give you some empirical information in case you want some proof of these arguments. Now, I did find that when Vietnam was escalated in 1965, the State Department informed the International Committee of the Red Cross that it accepted the full sway of the Geneva Conventions, i.e. not just Common Article 3, to what it said was an international conflict. The U.S., Dean Rusk wrote, the ICRC, has always abided by the humanitarian principles enunciated in the Geneva Conventions and will always do so. But again, I think that not only wasn't noticed, but was feasible because levels of patriotic engagement were high enough and traditions of debate around the law of war weak enough that our recent contestation around means and methods of fighting was unimaginable. At the very least, when we compare that statement to what actually transpired, we must conclude not that American allegiance to powerful rules of war was high, but that no one regarded the law of war as a significant constraint, including moral constraint. And so it was broken without a second thought, massively. And that's true whether it comes to the mistreatment of POWs, most definitely not excluding torture, on a massive scale, and also various counterinsurgent practices that often efface the distinction between soldier and civilian. Not to forget napalm, phosphorus, Agent Orange, and perhaps above all, massive aerial bombardment that in principle was in violation of the law, and which we would now, I think, even the military today, reject out of hand as brutal and illegal. And yet, at home, few spoke out about these acts. I think there were credible reasons for this. Patriotism. It was easy to believe that allegations which were raised and information available was communist propaganda. Some of it was. And the fact that the far left was for a few years after 1965 the pretty much exclusive source of the charge of war crimes, I think also made it easy to dismiss the charges and the information. Now just remember, for those of you who are alive then, Bertrand Russell's famous International War Crimes Tribunal, where, among other things, Jean-Paul Sartre, famous French intellectual, charged American genocide. But these people were dismissed. And even they, when they raised war crimes prior to My Lai, always said American aggression was the main crime. With war crimes, crimes of the conduct of war, the kind of expectable consequence of aggression. I think if we were going to do a fair history of the history of consciousness of war crimes after World War II, the Nuremberg tradition, which these people invoked a lot, and the international idea of genocide, we'd have to give lots of credit to the Russell Tribunal. But again, in this country, they were ignored. Now consider our time. We lacked, after 9/11, mass conscription, generational unrest. We also lacked Cold War bipolarity. And for all of those reasons, more activist and political modes of dissent had lost their luster or prominence or availability. It's not that there aren't similarities between Vietnam and Iraq. If you take the cases of the Tonkin Gulf incident and WMD, in both cases, pretexts for war were undermined substantially after the damage was done. And in both the cases, America hasn't really punished its perpetrators. But the differences between the two conflicts predominate. So my own balance sheet in thinking about this is that legalism of the kind we've had at the center of our political contest after 9/11 has become a powerful tool in ways that were just unimaginable during the Cold War. I think that's because of hard work. The law regulating the conduct of war in counterinsurgent circumstances now matter for the first time in history and in a very new way. But it might also have been the response taken up because of the absence of other tools, notably political tools. And it also happened at the cost of the most prominent legalism, to the extent there was any, that you find in Vietnam era debates. And that's the campaign to restrain the war itself or end it through international law, where we have in general restricted ourselves to the mere restraint of war's brutality. Now in the long paper I'm inflicted on Sarah, I survey as best I can all the actors who invoked at any point the law of war between 1965 and the aftermath of My Lai. I can't cover all that. I would just cite to you that there was a lawyers' committee for American policy in Vietnam, and Richard Falk was its main academic ally. And their essentially sole concern was aggression. They saw themselves in the Nuremberg tradition properly, attacking aggression, not atrocity, which again hadn't figured more or less at Nuremberg. And indeed, when we look at the sources, the early days after My Lai didn't imply much change here, though most Americans, as far as I can tell, rallied around the perpetrators, which is very different than what happened after Abu Ghraib. The anti-war movement took My Lai as fuel for the political agenda it had long since shouldered of ending the war and got a huge boost out of it. So instead of talking about those early figures, I'm going to talk about another man named Telford Taylor, one figure, to think about how we got from there to here. Happens to have been a Columbia University professor. He was also a retired brigadier general, and he was famous as the lead prosecutor after Justice Robert Jackson went home at Nuremberg. Taylor mattered because he was morally serious, and he made, after My Lai, allegations of war crimes respectable by moving them to the center of American debate. And because he offered an uncompromising discussion of how badly America had erred legally. But I want to suggest that he also mattered because, unlike all the prior actors, he separated allegations about violations of the conduct of war from any anti-war movement. And he did this in a once very famous book from 1970 called Nuremberg and Vietnam, an American Tragedy. Now, he had been a supporter of the intervention in 1965. Indeed, Richard Falk, when he reviewed Nuremberg and Vietnam on the cover of the New York Times Book Review, wrote that Taylor was the only person alive who could get the public to care about war crimes. But he did so in a specific way. In the book, his first move was very striking in relation to what I've been saying about the priority of aggression at Nuremberg and an initial anti-war legal activism. He dropped aggression. He cast doubt on the whole idea of charging aggression. It was malleable, especially in this sort of circumstance, unlike at Nuremberg, where it was obvious that Hitler was evil and that he had started World War II. Vietnam showed that one man's aggressor was another man's victim, and where are you going to get with an aggression charge? And he criticized Richard Falk aggressively. Falk had said domestic courts should adjudicate in the United States whether the country was guilty of aggression and let people burning their draft cards off the hook. But Taylor said Nuremberg never conferred a right on anyone, let alone a responsibility to avoid military service just because you think your country's war is illegal. And for courts adjudicating that claim without the captured archives on which the Nuremberg trials had been able to rely, there was no way to hope that a court could find a country, its own country, criminally aggressive. And so he said, let's drop aggression and concentrate on war crimes, atrocity crimes. He thought there had been immense war crimes. My Lai wasn't an aberration. He was shocked, if you may remember this, by a New Yorker journalist articles, Jonathan Schell, who had depicted counterinsurgent practices. And he was also very concerned about how air power was used, notably in what were then called free strike zones. He also said, and this is right, that it was illegal for the U.S. to eject civilians from a place with no intention of raiding. In fact, that's flatly illegal, I think, but it happened. He indicted that. He also noticed, and this was based on a pretty well-known trial of someone named Lieutenant James Duffy in 1970, that the commanders of the American forces in the era when their goal was to achieve high body counts to prove they were degrading the other side's forces, in a way encouraged soldiers to ignore very basic rules. So Lieutenant James Duffy had shot someone who'd laid down his weapon, and that's not, can't do that. Now Taylor did leave a lot out, even as he moved from aggression to war crimes per se. Like the Phoenix program, lots was known about that, but he didn't say much about it. But he was terrifically influential. As Falk put it, he's influential because he was so conservative. Falk had included everyone in his indictment, maximalists, and it indeed said the whole war was a war crime. But Taylor said, no, let's look carefully. But when he looked carefully, the amazing thing was that he found so much so wrong with American conduct. Now these two lawyers were actually, they went around universities arguing with one another. They were squash partners even. And Taylor essentially went very far towards Falk's position once he dropped aggression as the main framework. He went on the Dick Cavett show, which I gather people watched at the time. And he said, General William Westmoreland, who's the commander of U.S. forces until the Tet Offensive, is a war criminal. And this caused a huge stir. He implied that Lyndon Johnson should be held to account, possibly. And that caused a huge stir. There was really one point on which Falk bridled when he welcomed Taylor's intervention. And that's because Taylor belittled the anti-war movement. Taylor wanted to be a lawyer independent of anti-war politics. So you might see, if you understand what I'm saying, that in Taylor's activism you find an early attempt to sever jus in bello from jus ad bellum. Anti-war politics were dropped for anti-torture politics, or war crimes generally. And a legalistic concentration, as in our time, on how war is fought alone, leaving aside whether it's fought and when it's right to do so. And I think in general you could say that his marginalization of aggression proved fateful because it led us to reimagine and misremember the Nuremberg trials. From having been about aggression in real history in the 40s, they became in our memories about atrocity, as if that's what mattered. Just not true to people in the 40s. Now, I don't want to take this argument about Taylor too far. At the end of the book, he actually came out against the war, per se, because of its criminality. couldn't save it from its execution. And though he dropped aggression as a legal charge, he still wanted it to be debated politically. He wrote, "To say judges shouldn't answer the question of whether Americans are aggressors isn't to deny the reality and significance of the question itself." So to that extent, the Nuremberg leading charge, though now unviable as a domestic legal claim at least, still mattered as a political claim to undermine the war itself. Of course, his own hope for putting war criminals in jail went unrealized, except for Lieutenant Calley. And Taylor also did steer clear of popular mobilization of the kind that Falk had made central to his career. But he did intend clearly to deploy the law for political ends, and I think in that sense he was in a somewhat different world from ours. Okay, well, let me conclude. What happened between then and now, even if you're willing to see in Taylor's career a premonition of us? Well, I think the main event was the disaster of George McGovern's candidacy in 1972. I put this in because Moshik wanted me to talk about policy at the Kennedy School.
It wasn't in your paper.
James Mann, you may have seen a recent book he wrote called The Obamians, about Democratic Party foreign policy. And interestingly, he says, the Democrats today, or until recently, have been haunted by two Georges, Bush and McGovern. And he says that the Obama presidency, with all the continuities we know about with Bush-era counterterrorist policies, was significant because it was when the Democratic Party finally expurgated McGovern's ghost to the point that Democrats would rather, he says, prefer to be haunted by Bush's ghost rather than be associated with any kind of anti-war politics. So I think that's one thing that happened. The anti-war movement collapsed and died in the early 70s. But here's another positive spin to put on our history. America self-moralized after Vietnam through attention to how war is fought. McGovernites, there's a great historian here this term named Barbara Keyes who's showing this in a fantastic forthcoming book. McGovernites learned you can't indict America and win elections. But they turned out to be the historical actors who just a year or two after McGovern's defeat forged the U.S. human rights movement. Hadn't existed during the Vietnam era. But they created it. Maybe they created it at a bit of a high price because they made mainly the crimes of other regimes the focus of that movement. But movingly, I think, at least compared to Vietnam, it has made these legal norms powerful. Otherwise, we can't explain their force after 9/11. Maybe more movingly, I think the military self-legalized, and I think this is an unexplained story. It has taken on the law of how it fights wars, I think, far more than some other sectors of American society. More than at any time during the Cold War, it teaches and follows the law of humane conduct in war as a hard and self-imposed constraint, at least to some extent, and for the first time in U.S. history on my reading, certainly in counterinsurgent warfare. We have to explain why there are so many lawyers at CENTCOM in Florida and at drone facilities wherever they were, hovering over the screens, authorizing what the soldiers want to do. Something that, if you have any idea of what targeting was like in Vietnam, is totally unimaginable and is a revolution, I think. So I'm going to say something favorable about Jane Mayer now. She wrote a great article about how a West Point officer flew to Hollywood to tell them to stop making 24. And I think that's a kind of specimen of this revolution. And maybe like an unprecedented episode of the military trying to exercise humane control on the civilians. unimaginable, I think, in Vietnam, and a big change, whatever you think of our counterinsurgent practices today. So in many ways, I think when it comes to the law of war, we're basically the heirs of the Vietnam War's moral aftermath, thanks to an unprecedented attempt to take the law of war seriously. But we are wayward heirs. We've dropped jus ad bellum, most obviously. We've made the imaginative move of Taylor and his heirs from aggression to atrocity as the thing we hate most and want to criminalize most. Now, the War Powers Resolution also came out of Vietnam as a matter of domestic law, not international law. But as we now know, after the Libyan campaign, it's basically a dead letter, though it governs the resort to force. But in our culture, constantly, I think in public controversy, academic jousting, and so on, at least since the fracture of consensus around Iraq, we have taken how we fight very seriously, the law governing it very seriously. Perhaps mainly because John Yoo denied the applicability of these rules in the first place, so brazenly. I think we should have a mixed balance sheet about this. We should note that the intense focus we have now on how war is fought in the feud of liberals and conservatives occurs in the relative absence of interest of when war is legal in the first place. And with priorities like that, liberals risk humanizing war, indeed humanizing counterinsurgency, even as conservatives who have to defend against encroaching law, like in Jack Goldsmith's book, don't have to contend, really, with invocations of international legal constraints on going to war in the first place. So I think we should celebrate our newfound concern with the law of war, at least its conduct, but not as uncomplicated goods, as if there are no alternatives besides a world in which the executive could fight or torture without constraints. In the Vietnam past, there were much worse crimes without significant consciousness of atrocity or bulwarks against atrocity. And I think it's preferable to count on the array of new controls, legal controls, that have been created since then by hard work and basically from scratch. So we have what they lacked at the time. I want that to be clear. But I think the reverse is also true. They had a massive popular movement that helped end our war making. And they had a crystalline moment, which we have not yet had, that allowed them some deep self-criticism about our place in the world. But then we didn't have those sorts of social movements after 9/11. Or in the age of the Tea Party, we did, but they moved from one side of the political spectrum to the other. So I'll stop there.
All right, thanks, Sam, for that fascinating, compelling presentation. I turn to Sarah Sewall, who is a lecturer in public policy here at the Kennedy School. And this year she is visiting as Minerva Chair, Minerva Chair at the Naval War College, not too far in Rhode Island. Her experience and accomplishments in the fields of human rights and humanitarianism are enormous. Among other things, she is the founder and faculty director of the Mass Atrocity Response Operations Project. In 2010, she led a study for the U.S. military on efforts to reduce civilian casualties. Prior to that, she directed the Obama Transition's National Security Agency Review in 2008. During the Clinton administration, she was the first Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Peacekeeping and Humanitarian Assistance. She has written prolifically, among other things. She's the author of Parameters of Partnership, U.S. Civil-Military Relations in the 21st Century, which came out in 2009, and the introduction to the U.S. Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Manual. So Sarah will provide a very sort of insider comment, I think, on Sam's presentation, and then when she's done, we'll open the floor for discussion.
Thank you, and thanks for inviting me to be here, and thanks for letting me read a really interesting
And also on sabbatical.
paper that raises actually, I think, more questions than you answer, and I think you'd probably be the first person to admit that, and I feel very badly for Telford Taylor having to bear the brunt of responsibility for America's eschewing the responsibility to think about when it goes to war and instead focus on the how. And you occasionally, in your narrative, speak to sort of material and political factors that go beyond the ideational and the normative. And I think that's a place that perhaps I can add some more context as we try to unpack this story and separate out some definitions and some causalities. So I think what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the jus ad bellum, jus in bello piece and deepen the question by asking whether they're necessarily one or the other. And talk a little bit about the difference between law and norms, because I've been working on a big piece on this, and it's something that really occupies me in an interesting way. I think we sometimes do ourselves a disservice in the States by being so legalistic, and I think that's part of the answer to the puzzle about how we got away from asking whether the war was just. And then finally talk in some detail about this issue of standards and law and whether or not really the right frame for judging either our interest in law or our disinterest in law is the treatment of prisoners as opposed to the conduct of offensive operations. And I think that's a huge issue and a huge disconnect. So when you asked at the outset, is it bad history, what's with Meyer's sort of fixation, she's looking at a teeny slice and she's looking at claims instead of practice. And I think that's sort of the short answer to how she got it, in my view, so wrong and so narrowly at the outset. Okay, so when we think about the issue of when it is just to go to war or when war is legal, one of the big problems with that question is that it's very interesting, but there's not a big body of law on it, right? Yeah. I mean, there's, there was the claim that even Falk, I think, would admit now was too broad a brush of, we're all responsible for aggression. Now we have the UN Charter, but it's not as though there are a lot of nooks and crannies for lawyers to dig into and to argue about. And it's not as though there's a lot of practice that creates the traction and friction of which sort of the casuistry and the argument is developed. And so I think part of the answer to the question is simply that, it's a much more abstract argument, and you don't have a lot of sort of grist for the mill for the legal profession or for any kind of sort of debate performance, if you will. But one of the things I would also point out, I think you've reminded us that Taylor's piece was so important, and if I remember, I'll come back to a different critique of Taylor, because I think there's always a problem with parsing it fine, and I've found myself in that position, and it's an uncomfortable position to be. But Walser wrote a really important book after Vietnam, and Walser's book, Just and Unjust Wars, anybody who did IR has read it. Walser's book was almost the antidote to Taylor, right? Walser said you have reasons that are just why you go to war, and you have reasons that are just why you fight war. And he talked in great detail about the two. And he talked about the difficulty of separating them, even though he talked about the necessity of separating them in order to walk through that ad bellum door to get to the in bello analysis. So there was an a priori sort of nesting in his way of thinking about the challenge, but it was very integrated. And he really, I think of Walser as more than anyone in America's intellectual history that led us back to reasoning about war and invited us to have a conversation that was not a legalistic conversation. One of the things that's important is this question about law and norms. Walser's view of morality was that law was perhaps the finest point of it. It was the most developed point. It was the codified point. But he didn't pretend that the law of war unto itself was, or that the crime of aggression, or that the UN Charter was enough to explain and understand and debate law as a social phenomenon or a political phenomenon. And his whole invitation in his book is to bring us back into a dialogue that's broader than the letter of the law. And you know, he was very insistent on insisting that, you know, it's what we say and it's not always even what we do that helps create our understanding of what is required of us, even if we're imperfect in our practice. And those are subtleties that escape the law. And those are really important invitations to a political movement to join it, or really important invitations to people who aren't lawyers to join it. Really important invitations to the citizen to own responsibility for both the decision and the conduct. So I think, you know, Walter's book was really influential, and I think it left open the possibility for us as a country and as a society to engage in both of them. And yet I fundamentally agree with your premise, which is that we've dropped that ball. The question of whether a war is just and should be fought, it's just not part of our lexicon. Whether we're using legal terminology or whether we're using ethics to make our claim. And even the religious piece that was dominant in the debate about nuclear weapons for a while, in the late 70s and 80s, has dropped off. And so we have no vernacular, we have no context really for talking about these wars, except for these really flaccid political processes. And you referred to the War Powers Act. You know, I worked on on the Hill for 6 years as the senior foreign policy advisor for Senator Mitchell, and you know, we dealt with war powers all the time. You know, Libya strikes that we don't even remember now, the Persian Gulf reflagging operation. I mean, the War Powers Act has been dead for a very long time. It didn't die with 9/11. It's been dead. And it's also a really stupid law. I mean, I can get into that if you're interested in the Q&A, but it's not, it doesn't engage Walter's question. It doesn't ask whether or not the war should be fought, or the war is justified. It just says that if you're in there long enough with the right things, then we get to have a vote on it. I mean, it's backwards. It's so American and political. It's procedural, right? It's functional. It's not about the underlying issues that we were supposed to be addressing post-Vietnam whenever we thought about using force in the future. So I don't think it was necessary that we follow Taylor and reject the question of why for the question of how, but I do think there were some very sort of material factors that contributed to that. And you alluded to one when you talked about the post-Vietnam energy sort of metastasizing or fueling the human rights movement. And I think that plays into the development of norms and the development of expectations. It was a trajectory in which the law in the jus in bello frame evolved. So while we basically talked about the UN Charter and then left it there for political adjudication thereafter and none on the US domestic front, we went on as an international community to develop international law in very important ways. And the human rights movement, 1977 additional protocols, were really sort of an intertwined and seminal moment in deepening that and making it much more real. And the law itself reached more deeply into those nooks and crannies for engaging in factual analysis of what we could see on the television. And that gets to another material point, which is it's not that we didn't know what was going on in Vietnam. You're absolutely right. We had some visibility. We had a press corps that was much freer than it's been in recent wars. But there was often a real time lag. I mean, you think about how My Lai broke. It broke much later than it actually occurred. And, you know, we're still finding out about Tiger Team revelations. I was just buying a book on Amazon today, and I realized that there's a book coming out in January on Vietnam that goes through a bunch of different newly released records and paints a picture that I think will very much strengthen the claims that you're making about the nature of the use of force in Vietnam. We didn't necessarily know all those things in real time there. And you can argue, and I would argue, that we still have a time limit now. I mean, it was thanks to Time magazine, not the military chain of command, that we found out about the Haditha shootings, right? So it still exists, but it was shortened. And it was shortened in part because of technology. It was shortened in part because of our own ability to respond to it. It's shortened in part because of the sort of global media piece. And I think that's not an unimportant aspect of our focus on jus in bello too. So we've got this law that really developed and became complex and fulsome, and so could involve lots of lawyers. And then we had lots of visibility into the cases that could allow us to think about how that law applied and whether or not it was being followed. And I think those help us understand that. Now, being someone who's worked in politics and has a very institutional sort of view of the mechanics of how change happens, normative or otherwise, I look too at the industry of the human rights organizations and frankly academia as it pertains to law. And there are a lot of people who make their money on this kind of analysis of what happens, whether it's Human Rights Watch or whether it's folks writing in law review articles. And what do they look at? What do they look at? And what's easiest to look at? What's easiest to look at are the words on a piece of paper. And it's much harder to relate them to the battlefield where you don't have operational knowledge, you may not have full information because there's classification issues in addition to time lag issues. And you may not even understand really from the military point of view how the law applies. And I'll come back to that later when I talk about the standards issue. But all that is to say that I think the question is a really profound one, but I think there are answers that go beyond our hero, Telford. Now, maybe I'll do standards next, because I guess the point that I just would want to make now about differentiating between the law and normative argument is that I actually think that law gets in the way of normative argument. I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I took some law school, but I'm not a lawyer. And I think that I would argue that part of the way the human rights industry has decided to merge advocacy and legal analysis has actually made it more difficult to promote the kinds of changes that they say they want to promote. And we can get into that more in the Q&A. But there is no reason why we can't demand of American soldiers something that is reflective of our values, regardless of whether it is embodied by consensus in law. And I feel much more comfortable in inviting Americans to participate in that demand if it's cast in those terms, where they can access it, as opposed to legalese, where they can't understand it. And I think that's also, ironically, a piece of the problem in terms of the political engagement on the law of war front. And so what's the problem? You just argued that we were very engaged with Abu Ghraib. Well, okay, if you equate caring about how war is conducted with the treatment of prisoners and the torture of them, and I think Meyer's point was that Bush changed the written law. It wasn't just that the practice was different, because there's always been an enormous gap between what we say the law requires and what we do. And that is actually anticipated by law. Anybody who knows the law knows that, the standards for applying law change with, that's the whole beauty of the Constitution, right? I mean, they change with capacity, they change with understanding, they change with norms. So there's always been a huge gap, and I think the real point about the torture piece was that it was a rejection of the law qua the law, black letter law. It wasn't just customary practice that was creating turbulence. It was a rejection of the law. But to me, the much more important point is that torture and how you classify detainees is such a small subset of the law of armed conflict. And most of my work has been on the use of violence in the course of combat operations, because that's where most people get killed. And so, to me, when we talk about our performance vis-a-vis the law of armed conflict, that's the body of activity that I believe is most revealing and most difficult and most contested. Because, it's really nice we've got an enumeration of what constitutes, torture and what doesn't. And we don't have that enumeration for what's disproportionate. We don't have that enumeration for what constitutes a military objective. We don't have that for most of the other aspects of the conduct of actual hostilities, which is where civilians die. So let me make a couple of points that try to round that out. If you look back to, well, first of all, vis-a-vis this book, which I haven't read yet, but I'm dying to read, but I know from what you've said that I will agree with your critique of this book, because first of all, we've been nasty since the Revolutionary War. Our view about our great citizen companions and waiting at the harbor was that we should just bombard them if we needed to. It really wasn't a problem if the new-to-be Americans were in the city, because we had to beat the British. And we've just sort of had that strand since the beginning and carried through, and not just overseas, but in Indian wars. And what's interesting about the Lieber Code, of course, is that it came up as we were fighting our brothers, literally. And it wasn't just to get rid of that American exceptionalism piece. It wasn't the only source. We claimed it was the source for everything else that came after in the Geneva Conventions at all. And, the Swedish Adolphus Gavustus, or whatever his name is, I'm not remembering, would take great issue with that because he had his own code long before we thought of one. But the American practice of, the American military practice has always been divorced from the standards that we held ethically or legally. And you only have to look at the precision bombing debate in World War II to appreciate the tension and the intense discomfort among Americans who perceived that the justice of their cause and the morality of their profession was such that they would never do anything but precision bombing, but who were committed by virtue of their practice and ultimately their decision to go to night raids too, to basically carpet bomb and eventually to even target refugees knowingly in an effort to complicate German mobilization. I mean, we've always had that gap. Now, I can make the argument, and if you're doing sort of a historical review, it's an interesting exercise. I'm trying to do it now, but you can make the argument that the gap has narrowed over time. And I think that's right. I think the gap is narrower in Vietnam than it was in World War II. And I think the gap is narrower in counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan than it was in Vietnam. That doesn't mean that there's not still a gap. And if it's your mother or your grandmother in that gap, it's just as outrageous. But I think that a combination of factors have combined to reduce that gap, not the least of which is our ability to inflict that same enormous destructive power from a distance that keeps us safe, but where we can also see more than we used to be able to see. So we've been able to sort of have our cake and eat it too. And I don't want to get sort of drawn into a long discussion there, and let me just leave it by saying that we've always had that gap. And I think that gap is inherent in the law of armed conflict for reasons that have to do with the nature of the body of law and the actual character of the written law. I mean, the ability to argue, even among military lawyers within the NATO alliance, about the meaning of specific provisions of IHL is significant. And for example, our insistence on the claim that war-sustaining objects are permitted by law, and most of our European allies' views that they're not. And that's just one example. So the law itself has much room for interpretation, and the practice itself has changed, even though I think there will always be a significant gap there. But the point that I want to make, tying it back to norms, and part of the danger of relying on law as a way of understanding war is what I've just referred to. But part of the other danger is that we never should be satisfied with law as the standard, because the U.S. military's view of the law is very different from the expectations that much of the world has of our conduct. And frankly, the expectations that many people in uniform have of our conduct. The U.S. military's view of the law of armed conflict is that it's a floor, it's a lowest common denominator, it's de minimis. And while the human rights community will argue that our capacities make us, in order to meet that same low standard, still perform at a higher standard, the U.S. rejects that claim. It says that the claims are constant. And so what we have done by way of how we fight wars, and I am arguing in work that I'm doing now, that it really began post-Desert Storm, is try to think about how to fight in a way that is well above the standard that we accept as law. And we should. But the lawyers who were in the field and all those layers approving all those targets, they would have proved all the targets in Dresden, they would have proved all the targets in Vietnam, just like they had proved the targets that they prove today, because the standards change. But what's different now is that now they might say to the commander, that's perfectly legal, sir, but you do know that if you do that, the consequences can be X or Y or Z. Those aren't legal judgments. That's not legal advice. And it's just as likely that the cautions will come not from the JAG, but from the number two, sitting next to the commander, who's got to, ask people to carry out the order in whatever form it happens. So what's happened vis-a-vis this humanization of war, in coin in particular, is not that the laws changed at all. It's not that the role of lawyers has changed. It's not that the advice comes in a more timely fashion. It's that the military's own perception of what it took to be successful in the context of these wars required it to act in ways that exceeded the floor of the law of armed conflict. And therefore their practice and all of their non-legal but nonetheless binding directives, whether they were called escalation of force instructions, or they were called special instructions for the air crews, or they were called tactical directives issued by people to add yet another layer of restraint, those were not required by law in the military's view. They were required by the operational necessities of winning. And they'll never accept that those are legal standards, but they do them under certain circumstances when they feel it is in their interest to do that. And so Human Rights Watch misses the boat when they argue that we're not upholding the standard X, because in so many ways the practice has the potential, and in some cases has actually in fact exceeded what the military will ever concede as a legal standard. And if part of what we want to do is engender citizens to think about this, I believe that's the language that we have to use. But before I stop, and I'm about to stop, I want to echo and heartily agree with a point that you made, which is that Human Rights Watch may care terribly, and Americans may care terribly about torture because torture is an issue that can apply to our guys. And torture is an issue that has a much clearer standard. And torture is an issue that happens when you're in full control of somebody. But boy, you get to the question of a haditha where there's any plausible claim that there's self-defense or that we were acting to prosecute the mission, and Americans don't give a darn. We don't give a darn. We have a huge blind spot domestically in the way we think about the use of force. And I would argue that, again, you have to look at contextual factors like the all-volunteer force and the guilt that people feel for the fact that we're fighting these wars by contract, and they don't affect us other than at the top. But there is a huge blind spot. So I think the way you would invite people in is through moral argument rather than legal discourse. But I do believe that there has been, for a very long time now, since Vietnam, this blind spot and unwillingness to second-guess those who act in the field. And I think it's a huge problem, because if the people that killed 20, I can't even remember how many, 7, women, kids, men in a wheelchair, in successive raids of houses in Haditha in 2005 in Iraq, can't be found sort of guilty and actually punished, then to me, even Telford Taylor's parsing of the most egregious crimes, I'll cede the ones that may be arguable, but I'm going to focus on the most egregious crimes and call those crimes. If we can't prosecute people who do what happened at Haditha, then we have a real failing in our legal framework as well. And we have a blind spot politically that keeps us, I think, from engaging this broader argument about the morality of both use in bello as well as use at bello.
Before I open it up, Sam, would you like to respond to what Sarah was talking about, or should I?
Sure, might as well, just briefly.
Okay.
I mean, I'm really grateful for all those comments, which seem generally right. I mean, I'll single out a few places where I wondered or I wasn't sure. So one is in your opening claim that jus ad bellum is kind of flimsy, gives us very little to go on. And I think that's the general view today. But I think we should recognize that, first of all, it was the dominant core of moral theorizing about war in the entire Western tradition.
Sure.
And in modern times, it was revived to be the central project of American law from the interwar period until Vietnam, I think, when it was dropped. And so our ancestors, including lots of moral philosophers long before Michael Walzer's, thought this was the central problem. And seems as if in the annals we could find a lot to work with there. And mainly the starting point, which I think they held, which is that if we abolish war, we abolish the evil of conduct. And certainly that, I think, is a lost tradition. About the time lag, I mean, that's got to be right, but I don't think we should go too far with it. As you noted, there were incredibly lax standards in Vietnam, which was called the first war in our living room, because of television, about what information the military would control compared to a later era of invading. So, I mean, when I did the research for this, I read Jonathan Shell's articles in the New Yorker, and they shoot civilians in front of them. They essentially torture POWs in front of them. And so there just wasn't the kind of, and that's all before My Lai is known about, which was because it was suppressed. So I think, I think it's an important point, but I think not a decisive one. One thing I didn't fully understand of what you said is about how American lawyers in the military would authorize the same targeting. So in my understanding, firebombing Tokyo or dropping an atomic bomb on Hiroshima is just flatly illegal because it's targeting civilians.
It wasn't at the time, so the application of law is consistent.
I don't know about that. I mean, I think, certainly now if you asked if it was illegal. After the fact, interestingly, Telford Taylor was forced to take up this issue in Nuremberg and said it was wrong, but as a matter of customary law, since all sides engaged in civilian bombing during World War II, we can't criminalize it. But there's no doubt there was a rule about it.
The U.S. position always is that state practice
Right, of course,
trumps,
state
so
practice, right.
that's what you're hearing.
And then in Vietnam, which is after 1949, so there's already a civilian portion to the Geneva Conventions. There was lots of direct targeting of civilians, which again, is flatly illegal.
But I'm not sure that lawyers are ever going to be at that level of the fight, ever, on your shoulder like little gnomes.
Okay.
All right, so I'm going to take questions. I only ask two things. One, that you introduce yourselves. Second, actually three things. Second, that you pose a question with a question mark at the end. And the third, that you try to keep it as brief as you can so that we can get as many people involved as possible. So, yes, Bill.
I'm Bill Hogan from the Kennedy School. So Sarah mentioned it just at the end here, and I'm not sure whether you've addressed it at all, but I'm puzzled that the role of the draft wasn't more prominent in this story. My recollection is that the anti-war movement was an anti-draft movement. And then that changed after we got rid of the draft, and everything in the military changed because of the volunteer army that you talked about. And I don't quite understand how to explain the connection for all these things, but it seems it must be more prominent than what I heard here.
Should I? No, I did mention conscription, but probably too briefly as a causal factor, because certainly it's the case that we can't explain the anti-war movement without acknowledging the importance of conscription. But I think we would be mistaken, by the same token, to reduce the anti-war movement to self-preservation on the part of the youngsters who had draft numbers that were too low. Because as I mentioned, it was about the war itself. It did lead to public argument about the war. And it did connect in ways I indicated with other things, like the civil rights movement, with which it was roughly contemporary. And so there's just no doubt that it's a causal factor, maybe the most important one, explaining why they had an anti-war movement and we don't. There's just no doubt about that. But if we reduce the anti-war movement to that factor alone, I think we miss lots of the moral substance of the argument around the Vietnam War that I recited.
I have you.
Next. Matthias, this is also Kennedy School. I have a couple of questions about the relative importance of use of vellum and use in bellow. So So my naive understanding of this was that actually jus ad bellum, as of course important it has been through history, had a major hiatus for a couple of centuries, namely roughly between the middle of the 17th century and then after the First World War, right? And this wasn't, I mean, of course, there was failure always, but the point really was that both the causa justa criterion and the intentio recta criterion no longer made much sense to people after many decades of religious warfare, right? There just wasn't a mindset for that anymore. So the shift went over to jus ad bellum, jus in bello, and so then in this period up to the Napoleonic Wars, we have a relatively peaceful time in Europe, where in principle, countries can go to war with each other, but the theoretical focus is on, keeping these wars limited. And then it was after the First World War that the jus ad bellum comes back in this very limited form as wars are generally outlawed, and that means the one criterion, the one causa justa is if you're actually acting in self-defense to make sure that they stay out. So is this also is this a way of making sense of what you said about the historical importance of and the second is also connected to jus ad bellum. So the Nuremberg trials, you said this was primarily about war of aggression, but if I think back at who these people were, so we have these roughly 25. They are accused of 4 different things, so I have 2 ad bellum things and 2 in bello things. Right? The 2 in bello things are war crimes and crimes against humanity, right? And about half of these guys at Nuremberg are just, even though they are very senior, of course, they're the most senior they can get their hands on at that stage, but even of those, half are really not senior enough to be guilty of, crimes of aggression, right? But they are all guilty and they're hanged for that, for the war crimes and the crimes against humanity, right? So didn't you downplay the role of jus in bello concerns at Nuremberg a bit too much there?
Okay, very good questions. I basically agree with your depiction of the trajectory of the 2 kinds of law. I would say that we can't leave out a rather massive peace movement that emerges in the 19th century that may have been actually much more massive and influential than in the latter half of the 20th century, even in the Vietnam War. And the partisans of the exclusive focus in jus in bello in the 19th century are well aware of the peace movement. The lawyers are, and they're quite critical of it because they really feel, based on the reasons you recited, that there's no hope in criminalizing aggression, and that we should, let's say, approach the humanization of war indirectly through the way it's fought. Now, there's another caveat to that, which is that when the Hague regulations emerge after these conferences in 1899 and 1907, originally that's a peace conference, and the hope is to create some system of international arbitration. But those attempts fail, and so the move to jus in bello as it comes out of those conferences is really a second best kind of event. But by and large, you're right. I mean, whether you start the story there or in the interwar period with the spirit of Locarno and the Kellogg-Briand Pact, et cetera, certainly it's a revival of this lost tradition. But the point is, it then lasts for 50 years. Now, there's a debate about this. I think, by and large, the ordinary person thinks that jus in bello was all that Nuremberg was about. And indeed, if you go out on the street and say, what were the Nuremberg trials about, people will say the Holocaust. Yeah. And not only is that wrong, it's completely wrong, because even to the extent that the Nuremberg trials took up jus in bello, it marginalized the genocide of the Jewish people. Nonetheless, these crimes did figure. Interestingly, they were largely transferred because the Americans and Soviets were so interested in crimes against peace and aggression to the French. But we can find that these crimes are morally salient to some degree, even in the 40s. Nonetheless, I think it's a matter of great moral significance that through the rise of Holocaust memory, which of course is coinciding with we've turned to make atrocity the centerpiece of our moral imaginations, which clearly wasn't the case at Nuremberg, even to the extent Hussenthal figured it. I think that was a fateful development.
And then,
I find myself wondering how significant law is in this story after listening to the two of you. And I also, and even some of the specific arguments. For example, I was a part of that anti-war movement, and I was an expert on the selective service law after. But I remember before Telford Taylor, one of the arguments that was very powerful was that atrocities and awful things were intrinsic to the conduct of the war, and that it could not be separated from it. It's the same argument I get half my evidence for anything from the movies, right? It's the Battle of Algiers argument, the statement of General Mathieu, where he's asked about torture in Algeria. And actually, this is based on more or less real events. He's asked, what about the torture of the FLN? And he says, there's only one question: do you want France to remain in Algeria or not? If you say yes, accept the consequences. Now, it seems to me that argument was very powerful before Telford Taylor and before it became legalized.
No, look, it's a great point. I just want to note that I didn't say there was no attention to atrocity prior to My Lai.
No,
I said it was approached through non-legal frameworks, and that to the extent law figured in that era, it wasn't atrocity but aggression that had right place. So in the longer paper, I go to some length showing that Richard Falk, who's kind of the main legal actor, just doesn't care that much about atrocity. Now, I would also argue that for the broad American public, we're talking about just a few people who care about atrocity in the years 65 to 69. I think the first and main people are those protesting Dow Chemicals on the West Coast. And that's about burning babies. Sure, they invented napalm here on this campus. Good job. But it's really after, I think we agree that with the caveat that the attention prior to 1969 to atrocity is pretty minimal within moral frameworks.
I agree with you that the issue was the war and the conduct of the war, but there was also a notion that you couldn't really separate the two.
Right. Look, Telford Taylor, she's making this point too. I put a lot on his shoulders, mainly because he's kind of my, it's just a character in my story. But, a rich history would have many more characters.
My name's Tara McAlpey, and I'm a journalist, and I'm at the Shorenstein Center. So it's very interesting to hear how you guys talk about it. I'm also I'm the author of a book called Monstering, which is about Abu Ghraib. So my question is about the idea of atrocities as a political tool, right? It sounds bad. But I'm wondering about the examples. I think there are lots of good examples, but you started out with the New Yorker piece by Jane Mayer and described it as having a partisan agenda against Bush. And that makes them sound dumb somehow. And I'm not sure that's what you mean. If you have other examples of using atrocities as a political tool that it seems to be more compelling.
You mean unmasking atrocities, or actually inflicting them?
Inflicting would be like a higher level of political tool. No, talking.
Because there are many examples in history of using atrocities for political ends.
No, I just mean after 9/11.
After 9/11. So, no, I don't. I just think she's a bad historian. But my point there actually is that myths are helpful, and my own narrative would be that the liberal center of this country, which includes the New Yorker magazine, has a tactical situation after the invasion of Iraq, which it hadn't been against, but it begins to go bad, or there are second thoughts. And more generally, liberals are in a partisan situation of wanting to attack the president. Now, you could attack the war, but that's not really what happened until the campaign of President Obama made it a viable position. Instead, we find attacks on how the war was fought. And I think Jane Mayer's articles were incredibly brilliant in just telling us what happened. Finding, I think, barricannily these conservatives who tried to stop it. I think that is brilliant because it allowed her to suggest that this wasn't a partisan concern. It wasn't a partisan attack on the president, since after all, Alberto Mora, Jack Goldsmith, card-carrying Republicans had said, you may not break the law. As a general matter, I think everyone's political and everyone has an agenda. So for me to say that Jane Mayer has one is not a criticism. It's just trying to understand what her role in history is. It was also informational, and she's a brilliant journalist at what she does. Nonetheless, politics affected the way the violations of the law were presented to us in the Second Bush, in my opinion. You want to come back?
I
think Sarah.
I did want to say something though, because this bears on the distinction that I was trying to make between crimes committed during war and the special case of torture. I think part of the reason why this issue became an issue when so many other war crimes didn't was because you had conservatives. But a big piece of it, and it's not unrelated to the reason you had conservative support, was that the military actually really cares about this law. Because it's something that they think matters for them, in theory. It's a principle thing. And it was the JAD Corps really outing this issue and making the ties with McCain and Graham and all the rest that really solidified, because otherwise this would have been a drop in the bucket the same way, the Human Rights Watch report on targeting people who had cell phones in Iraq was a drop in the bucket, because you probably don't even remember. It became an issue because it was a flagrant change of law, where the paper was, as opposed to just the practice, and because it was one of these issues that was really different for the military and for the conservatives. And so I almost think that there's too much of a claim here about the importance of law and use in fellow in the American dialogue, because I only see its absence in so many other areas that I think are also really important.
Let me just interrupt the flow first to ask a question of my own. And this is actually two related questions. The first, I thought that somehow in your presentation, also in the paper I read, what I didn't see was the existence of this kind of discussion about the legitimacy of the war in Iraq. That did happen once, for example, the weapons of mass destruction that weren't there. Right? The idea that we went to war based on lies. Right? So it's not the anti-war movement of anti-Vietnam, which is a much more sort of on the premise that the morality of the whole war is wrong, but that here we have a situation in which there does emerge, I guess it's a fairly polite, then it becomes a little bit more aggressive, but we do have some discussion of the war that happens maybe not right away, but also not too late, right? It does happen within, even if you look at the 2004 presidential race, right? John Kerry gets up there and he says something which I thought was very interesting. Of course, he got killed for it, but he said, we didn't pass the global test, right, for launching preemptive war. So that to me was interesting. This is a mainstream situation where you have someone basically saying that the U.S. It's not a legalistic argument, but it does say that the U.S. is part of the world, that the U.S. has to meet this kind of global test, and it hurt him politically. But I thought that was something that I would like to hear you sort of talk about in the context of this paper. And I'll just leave it at that.
No, it's a great question. So in a stylized contrast between two eras, things get lost. And my main point is that the scope and scale and intensity of anti-war politics in Vietnam dwarf anything we've seen lately. Now, were the latter non-existent? No. But I do think we have to be very careful about our chronology. So as I've already suggested, in the run-up to the invasion, there's one international day of marching, but by and large, Americans, including the liberal media, accepts that this is a just war. And I think that that belief dies slowly to the extent it ever did. It's not that there aren't dissidents. Paul Krugman to this day is very proud of himself for being pretty much the only person in the MSM to cry foul over the administration arguments about WMD at the time. But in 2004, whatever evidence you might dredge up from then, I mean, Kofi Annan says that the invasion is a violation of the UN Charter, but that has no impact on U.S. debate. And so it's really, in my understanding, only 4 or 5 years later, around the Obama candidacy for president, that this becomes a really respectable mainstream position. And so my concern is what was going on in those years? Why, once the patriotic conformity of the initial period of the invasion began to falter, was dissent framed in terms of the law of war, in terms of outrage about Abu Ghraib? That's the question.
And just quickly, couldn't you, to sort of push back, if you look at the example of Vietnam, American involvement in Vietnam really begins in the 50s.
Of course, yeah.
The escalation happens in 1965. When does the anti-war movement really get? Yes, you have the voices, intellectuals who are writing, the far left, which doesn't exist anymore, but existed then mostly in the form of people writing in journals. Then in the late 60s, it gathers steam, but there's a time lag there too. So,
fair enough.
So actually, if you compare the two, you get a similar difference between the acceptance of the war on patriotic grounds, the escalation that sort of passes through without much protest, and then revelations that come through that trigger this anti-war movement that, you're right, doesn't really happen in response to Iraq, but the idea that the war is illegitimate happens in response to Iraq at around the same time that it took for Vietnam to kind of trigger that kind of protest.
Yeah, my take on it.
All right, yes, the gentleman.
Sarah said she couldn't find much law on use in Bell, and I think that's because use.
Could you introduce yourself, sir?
Oh, I'm sorry, Alan Ryan. I teach at Boston College Law School. Use ad bellum had always been primarily a theological doctrine, I think, more than a legal one. And what happened in Vietnam, and I also lived through it, was that we saw sort of a conflation of the two, where the argument was made that because there were atrocities happening in the war, therefore it showed that going to that war was unjust. In other words, use in bello was used to prove the proposition that it was a violation of use ad bellum, although not in those Latin terms. But that was essentially the argument, I think, that spurred the anti-war movement, which did predate the revelations about My Lai. What Telford Taylor said in his book, and what he said on that program talking about Westmoreland and LBJ, was not that they should be brought to trial. In fact, he said, that's not what I'm arguing, that's politically unthinkable. What he was saying is that if we applied the same standard to them as we applied after the war in the case of General Yamashita,
Exactly. That's right.
Supreme Court's decision in that case, which essentially reduced to saying that a commander is responsible for the crimes of his troops, even if he didn't know about them or there was no evidence that he ordered them or participated in them. What Taylor was saying, and he's my hero too, is that if we really were to be faithful to the law we announced back then Rusk and Westmoreland and I don't think he mentioned LBJ, but they would be at risk of being put on trial, even though everyone knew they wouldn't be. So I guess my question is where does that ghost, if you will, of Yamashita and the teaching of that case, how does that fare in the revelations of My Lai and in the years afterwards up to 9/11?
Right. So, I mean, now we're talking about legal responsibility for war crimes and the Nuremberg legacy, which, is widely taught about command responsibility. And there, I think we have, there is a sense in which that does get revived after My Lai as an idea that matters morally. It's in Walser's book, among other places, whom I think we should credit for taking this whole, body of philosophy and taking it out of pretty much exclusively Catholic precincts, or generally Christian precincts for the prior few decades into secular moral discussion. And that's a legacy, and it's taught in you probably teach this case or this subject. In my understanding, actual accountability for war crimes since My Lai has been essentially nil, except for Lieutenant Kelly. I think it is a case in which, when we look at figures citing Nuremberg precedents, which Americans wanted to make the law of the world, citing them against Americans, those cases haven't been followed to my knowledge, although the doctrines are there for us to pick up and use in a future political.
I agree.
Thank you. I'm Hui Cho, a visiting scholar at Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. I agree very much with Sarah's point that it need not to be an either-or question between the jus ad bellum and jus in bello, but there should have been more discussion about jus ad bellum. But my question is very much related to what you just had, the discussion about patriotism. Because I did read the exceptional American Society of International Law resolution, which pointing out the primacy of UN Charter 2.4 and the importance of jus ad bellum, and it did point out by very subtly that recent state practice may lead to certain confusion of the existing of the jus ad bellum, etc. So my question is that is there such a use your word, patriotic conformity pressure even among American scholars to openly discuss something that your country's state practice has kind of violated?
Do you want to? There are liberal and conservative international lawyers. In the piece, I reviewed how Richard Falk had to tangle with his own teacher named Myers McDougall, who was a major Yale international lawyer who was called by the State Department and the White House and told to put his people out to justify the war belatedly. And so there are lots of memos and speeches about how the war is illegal. It's just that this doesn't really get beyond the law journals. In our day, there are liberal and conservative international lawyers, and I mentioned some of their names. The conservatives are in the ascendant, I think, actually, in the legal academy. Very intelligent and important and often quite brilliant people. And they certainly have views about when the use of force in the United States is legal, according to the UN Charter. Few of them have the extremely radical views of some of the presidentialists around, who just think it's purely sovereign prerogative, and within U.S. sovereignty, the president's prerogative to launch our armies. I'd say, after Kofi Annan said that the U.S. really should have gone back to the UN Security Council before invading, I don't think the U.S. international law community really responded to that call or, got interested in the problem. And certainly the same, I think, is true of the grant of authority by the Security Council in Libya, where the Allies just on the face of the resolution went far beyond their entitled grant of power to engage in regime change, and it's clear that that was what they were going to do from the first, and that no big debate about that so far as I'm aware in the U.S. that it happened.
Liberal society has its own challenges. Very quickly, it was the liberals that pushed Kosovo, which was an illegal
Right.
war for a humanitarian purpose.
Right.
So they started breaking the machinery and the rules and the clarity for good. And once you take that kind of a utilitarian perspective, it can backfire on you, and that's what we got.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
We have about 3 minutes left, so and I know there are still questions, so I'm actually going to take a bunch of questions and somehow have Sam and Sarah magically resolve all of them in about 1 minute. So start with yes, you.
I'm Stefan Rimmer. I'm affiliated with the My Lai
Please be brief, thank you.
For international affairs. Two very brief questions and almost simplistic questions as well. One is, how would you relate the broad strokes of your presentation, especially concerning collective moral, the change in collective moral consciousness, to the rather simple fact of military failures? Do you think there's any awareness of military failure, or at least the fear of it, that somehow triggered, even with time delay, that triggered this moral change? And the second is, you've talked only a little bit about the disconnect between moral discourses at the United Nations and within the United States, but you haven't talked much about the international community. So do you see any relevance beyond the US debates?
My question actually follows very nicely from yours. My name is Rob Fletcher. I work for an international organization called the International Crisis Group. And the piece of the world that I know the best is the Middle East, and particularly Israel-Palestine. You can see a lot of these same debates playing out in other places. The Israeli army is just as concerned, if not more concerned, in terms of embedding lawyers in very small-sized units in order to protect themselves. Or if you go to the international level, the Goldstone report that came out was very much about how the war was fought in Gaza, as opposed to whether that war should have been fought. So I'm just wondering, what's the place of the international in this discussion? Is it that the U.S. system is so powerful it pulls the international community behind it? Is it that there are some similar processes happening in other places that parallel what's going on in the U.S.? Is it that there's actually an international component in this story which for whatever necessity you hold as an American story? So it's an impossible task in your 30 seconds.
I have time for one more question.
I would have very briefly two questions. One goes to the commentator and the other one to you. My question to you, if I have understood correctly, you are more in favor of moral norms than the legal settings. And I was wondering, hearing your criticism, which had as a central point the vagueness of law norms, whether this is a criticism that can be really also can be really true also from even more from moral norms. That was my question to you. And I was wondering whether you have any reasons for why anti-war movement today is to the stand where it is. I was thinking of the correlation of war crimes to terrorism, and perhaps to the feeling that every citizen is somehow, let's say, thinking that could be a possible victim of such acts.
Okay, just briefly, I have to talk
10 more seconds.
Talk later about military failure because I didn't fully understand that. The other questions before the last are really about the international context. I made a kind of principled decision to cut my losses and just focus on this American debate. I did notice that, especially the more left-wing lawyers like Richard Falk were in full communication with an international group of international lawyers in this all out, but Telford Taylor also went to Hanoi and happened to be there during Linebacker II. And this was widely, covered in the press. I mean, the more present version of the point, I think, is quite important. Clearly, opinion diverged pretty strongly after 9/11 about the lawfulness, let alone morality, of American war making, and it still does. I think it's not accidental that these issues have clustered around American and Israeli counterinsurgencies, since those are the two big cases where less powerful states don't have much influence except normative work in the international community. That is actually fairly new, I think. There were other states that took an interest in the matter in the Vietnam War, but in Cold War circumstances, the world was just much more divided now along bipolar lines, and it seems to me that the configuration is different now. Now, I didn't fully understand this question either. It's a very good one, I think.
There's a timeline and the prospect of failure makes people reevaluate the.
Oh, right. No, I meant hers, which was about, what was it about?
Anti-war movements.
Oh, anti-war movements.
Terrorism.
Yeah, and
Right. I think it's a fair,
correlation.
I'll put it this way. I'll change your question just so I can answer it. I'm often told, well, Vietnam didn't involve an attack on the homeland, whereas 9/11 did, and obviously they're different. But I would reply, communism was a genuine geopolitical challenge in a way that Muslim terrorism isn't objectively. And so it's hard to see exactly how we work out the comparison there.
People were pretty scared of communism.
I think that's my understanding.
Sarah, you get the last word.
The international element, one of the things that's changed dramatically since I first started really working on the laws of war in the battlefield issues is the degree of international scrutiny that's come to every battlefield almost now. And I think one of the things that's very important, and it gets to your point about Richard Falk, the academic legalism in the U.S. does have this ascendant conservative trend, but it has traditionally been quite liberal. And there's a lot of scholarship and a lot of activism, legal activism, that is connected with Europe principally. And those views of international law are so different from the way the U.S. military looks at international law. From their perspective, legal compliance in the U.S. is just a box to check, a consoling narrative. And that's one of the reasons why, to get to your question, I prefer a normative standard. Because a normative standard, you don't have to quibble about whether it's legal or not. You can talk about what you want and demand that. And I think we've seen huge progress in terms of the way the battlefield commander went through a period of being just scared about following the law. Now he knows that's not the standard. The standard is a different standard. It's maybe a media standard or a political standard, but it's based in our collective normative expectations. And to me, it's a much more powerful and democratic tool.
All right, please join me in thanking. Thank you all for coming.